Well, thank you very much, Brian, and thanks for the kind invitation to speak to you this afternoon. As you can see from the slide, I have multiple affiliations today. So the UK Energy Research Centre in the corner is my main day job, but I'm also based at the University of Sussex, which is in southern England, and that's actually part of the Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium that Jim Hall leads, and actually many of you in the audience are either part of or associated with in some way. So the work I'm going to talk about in this talk is really coming from the work we've been involved in that Infrastructure Transitions Research Consortium. Right, let's see if I can get this to work. Am I pressing the right button, is the question. That's it, got it. First intelligence test failed. I was an engineer, but I'm now a social scientist, so you can tell. So here's my outline. So first, why is governance important? So I'm talking about the governance of infrastructure interdependencies. And the reason I might labour this point slightly is that we talk about governance a lot, and we use the word governance in meetings such as this quite a lot. But occasionally somebody's brave enough to put their hand up and say, what actually do you mean when you're talking about governance? What is it? So I'm going to give you my definition, and then we can perhaps have a debate if it's different to yours. I'm going to talk about infrastructure transitions partly in a historical perspective, because I think this reinforces the point of why governance is important, that it's an important feature of history. Technical histories and infrastructure histories are often told in a rather engineering-based manner about the inventions and the infrastructures that have been put in. But the best histories actually also talk about how institutions, policies, regulations, and society as a whole developed alongside. I'm going to give you some highlights, but only brief highlights, from two case studies we've done in the Infrastructure Transitions project in my team, my small team at the University of Sussex, and then some conclusions and implications and possibly speculations about where we go from here to deal with these interdependencies from a governance perspective. A lot of the material I'll use is very much UK-based, because that's where I'm based, but where I can, I will try and make some broader points that are relevant to other countries. So this is a quote from a historian I've always rather liked, called Thomas Hughes. He's an American historian. If you haven't read his books, I highly recommend them, partly because he tells a history that isn't just about technology. It's about the people, the inventors, the institutions, and all these other things that go alongside. And just this really captures to me what a system is that includes attention to governance. So it's not just the physical things, the transmission lines, the generators, that make, in this case, an electricity system, but it's the institutions, the actors like the manufacturers, the companies, the regulatory agencies, and the laws. So all of those things matter too, and hence that last part of the quote really gets you into governance territory. Now, here is where my definition comes in, because I think there's an important distinction, and there has been in the social science literature on governance for a long time, between what we might call government and what we call governance. So this is just an example of what you might think of as government, which is just an example policy document from the UK government called the Carbon Plan, which was published in 2011. It was basically a set of policies and strategies set out in a rather top-down way by central government to say how are we going to meet our targets for reducing carbon emissions over the period to 2050. Unusually for the UK government, it had the word plan in it. Governments in the UK doesn't tend to do plans, where of course other governments do. But they do plans, but they certainly don't call them plans very often. But this is, if you look at the quote, it's very much about, well, how we meet our policy goals, and this is what we're going to do. So that's a sort of version of government. But actually, what governance means is really, it's partly denoting a shift away from the idea that government is the only decision maker that counts in governing these things, but also perhaps reflecting a reality which has been there for a long, long time, but just not acknowledged in an explicit way. I mean, one thing that's happened in many countries, and hearing what I've heard so far in this conference sort of reinforces it for me, at least in some, is this whole shift towards liberalisation and globalisation, which in many countries has meant restructuring of infrastructure sectors, corporatising the companies, or even selling them off, privatising them, and introducing competition and markets, means that the government is not directly in control of as much of infrastructure as it used to be. So the shift to governance is partly denoting the fact that power is being distributed amongst a number of different actors. So And that's gone alongside in some cases, and particularly here for in Europe, with the European Union getting more strength and powers is often transferred upwards, but not just to the EU in Europe, but to things like multilateral agreements, the World Trade Organization, and so on. So there are a lot of institutions now out there which have tended to strengthen over time, which are now taking decisions which directly impact on infrastructure sectors in individual countries. Power is also transferred outwards, you might say, which means that government isn't just a singular body anymore. I mean, it never was. We have departments that focus on particular areas. You know, most countries have an energy department or a health department and possibly an environmental department, overseen usually by a finance ministry, which will never give them enough money to do everything they want to do. But it's also transferred outwards to regulatory agencies, and they've proliferated in this era of liberalisation, particularly for infrastructure sectors. So having infrastructure regulators is now very common, often sectoral in focus, but sometimes they cross sectors. Also public-private partnerships to deliver large projects, for example, whether it be hospitals or whether it be pieces of railway infrastructure, for example. And in some cases, and this is rather a UK-specific point, and I don't know how much it translates across to other countries, there has been some decentralisation. I mean, certainly a topical example is Scottish devolution over the last 10 years and Welsh devolution to some extent in the UK. Of course, that's been in the news with the referendum. There's now a big debate in the UK about further devolution within England towards cities and city regions. Now, for some countries, Germany, I'll give as an example, then that whole decentralised mode of governance is rather normal and is very strong and important. So I suppose what that says is that governance is important because government operates at several different levels, you know, the supranational, the national, and the subnational. And so you've got decision-making by multiple actors, including governments, private sector and civil society. So for me, that captures what governance means. It's not only a singular decision-making body. You've got to actually marshal all of these actors and persuade them to buy into whatever strategy you wish to pursue. And of course, there's no one-size-fits-all model. I think that's clear. You know, every country is different in some ways. But I think the other dimension to this, and these news quotes are really from the UK because the energy debate in the UK over the last year has become very, very politicised, is to say that you know, multiple actors means multiple views. So having a singular view of what transition you want to go through with a single infrastructure sector, never mind multiple infrastructure sectors, is very difficult to achieve because people have different views according to their interests of what they want out of those sectors. So we've had all sorts of controversies about whether we go for shale gas, for example, with respect to reactions to perceived energy insecurity because of gas from Russia, although we in the UK don't use any gas from Russia, but that is lost on most politicians. We've had the whole debate about infrastructure investment in the power generation sector. Is there enough? Probably not going forward, but whose fault is it? Probably the government's for not being clear enough about its regulatory framework, but really a disagreement between the companies and the government about what should be done. There's been a whole controversy about freezing prices. In some countries, of course, prices are regulated to consumers. In the UK, they are not, but there's a suggestion we might re-regulate prices. And then controversies about particular forms of energy infrastructure, in this case, wind farms. Should we or should we not have more of them? So there's all sorts of political issues coming up, which really, for me, show how important the governor's perspective is. So governance isn't just about looking at all the actors and persuading them all to sign up to a program. It's actually recognizing that they have different interests and trying to understand the conditions under which you might be able to get coalitions of support for particular types of action. So that's governance itself. But what about the interdependencies part in the title? Now, this slide I take no credit for at all. David Elserson from the University of Newcastle actually was the designer, and I think somebody else put this into practice. There's a larger version you can see in the poster room, so you can look at the detail. But really, this is a really nice visual image to show you how the different infrastructure sectors interact between water, waste, electricity, and so on. I'm not going to go through it in detail, but hopefully it brings it home quite starkly. But I think one thing that's very hard to fit on this diagram, so it's no criticism at all, is how you fit governance, institutions, regulations, and people on there. There's a kind of allusion to a news report of potential disruptions in the bottom corner there, which suggests there's a strong social dimension, but clearly that's quite hard to represent on there. But clearly, as most of you know, these interactions are pervasive, arguably getting more pervasive, and they have implications for governance too. And I'll just give you an example of this, and I'll turn to the US. I'm going to come back to shale gas at the end with respect to the UK debate, which has been rather different. So famously, the discovery and development of shale gas and shale oil in the United States has made a very big difference to their energy picture. This is the State of Union address from 2012, saying that actually, we want this shale gas, this is a very positive development, but actually we really want to regulate it too. So trying to triangulate between energy needs on one hand and regulations on the other. And part of the reason for those regulations is fears about water contamination. So it's a classic case of interdependencies between two infrastructure areas, water in this case, and the development of natural gas for heating and electricity generation on the other. So of course, that's the government version of interdependencies. We can deal with it. On the other hand, governance says something differently. So government commissions reports saying, well, yes, there are some things to worry about with respect to water resources and the use of them and the contamination of them from shale gas. There are some independent reports on it. This is one from the World Resources Institute, a think tank. But at the same time, you also have some very informal governance going on with people intervening and saying, well, actually, we don't trust you. So there's been, if you look up shale gas and lighting water taps through Google, you get endless images of people lighting their water taps, and that image has become absolutely synonymous with fracking and the anti-fracking protests, let alone the fact that actually some of that gas is naturally occurring and actually fracking may not be to blame for it. But clearly, that water energy interdependence is not just a case of, if you like, top-down governance of deciding that we do water regulation better and energy regulation better. There's a strong dimension of civil society engagement and people protesting, which has a direct impact on what can be done. So some states in the US have had moratoriums on fracking, and certainly in the UK and many other European countries, it's either stopped or slowed down that development. So that's really important to take into account too. So just to move on from those definitional points now to a bit of history before I get onto my case studies. I won't spend very long on the historical perspective. But really, I just wanted to sort of reinforce this point I started with, that governance has been a part of the story of the development of infrastructures ever since we saw something that looked like an infrastructure being developed at all. Here I'm very much drawing on the work of Carlota Perez, another economic historian, evolutionary economist, written a lot of very interesting books about long-wave developments in history, but really very ambitious frameworks which link technological development with infrastructure development with broader changes in society, and particularly interesting, the role of finance, which meant that she became a very sought-after commentator in the aftermath of the financial crisis to say, well, is this another example of one of these boom and bust cycles for infrastructures? So here she goes through several revolutions or transitions: Industrial Revolution, the age of steam, the age of steel, some of them you would recognize, automobiles and so on, saying there's been a big change involved in technology, the development of infrastructures, often related with boom and bust cycles, the latest of which are really the dot-com bubble around the year 2000 of lots of ICT stocks, and potentially in the future a biotech revolution coming behind. But then she links the bubble and what they were called, and one of the features of those financial bubbles is that you actually got this infrastructure developed through speculation and people building things, even though in the end a lot of companies went bust and there were a lot of problems. An interesting point she makes is in the wake of those bubbles and the recessions, that's when governance and regulation really came in to try and, if you like, redistribute the gains of all of those investments that have been made in each case. So, we had investment in canals, railways, and other things all the way through to the ICT revolution. And then, well, we've got a box that's not really filled in at the bottom. Who knows? She speculates that maybe we're going to enter a global sustainable golden age. That remains to be seen. But often followed by eras of relative prosperity, at least in particular countries. I think the other part of the story, which I find interesting, and again from a broader governance perspective, is she also links it to changes in lifestyle. So there's not only the boom and the bust in the economic sense, and then the gains being shared and built on in better periods of economic development, but actually they become associated with different types of lifestyles and ways of life. So you get, for example, the age of oil and mass production, which started in the earlier 20th century, really underpinning what some people might call the American way. The idea that you have cheap fuel, the American way of life, consumer goods, and all of those things that came with it. Of course, that era didn't last forever, but that lifestyle point is really important to recognize. And again, speculating maybe we're going to move towards sustainable lifestyles. So hopefully that captures, it's a very quick tour, but I recommend her books to you if you're interested in pursuing this further, that governance, regulation, and lifestyles and behavior are really part of that story of long-term change. So going back to the UK now for a little while to talk about both what we've observed in the work we've done in the ITRC from a broader perspective, and then quickly what we found, some headlines from our 2 case studies we've looked at so far, which are still in the process of being written up. Some of these points will have resonance with other countries, as I've said. So first thing we found by looking at the history, and we didn't go back as far as Carlota Perez, we only went back to probably the middle of the 20th century, really looking at how governance of those sectors has changed. I mean, one thing which is fairly obvious, and it's probably echoed in many other countries, that if you look at the structure of governance of different sectors, then it's not the same in each case. So when you're talking about interdependencies, you can't map a set of institutions, say, from the water sector and assume you're going to find exactly the same equivalent institutions in the energy sector and just simply draw the dots between them horizontally. So, for example, in water for the UK, governance, although we have a national water regulator, it works in a set of regionally focused monopolies. So we don't have competition, like most countries, and each monopoly is regulated in a particular region of the country. There are a lot of EU regulations as well. Whereas if you go to the energy sector, we have natural monopolies for transmission, but the rest is open to competition, apart from the distribution network. So retail is competitive, generation is competitive, the companies are owned as part of pan-utility groups, and as one of the papers earlier today in the parallel sessions was saying, we're starting to see this emergence of local energy coming out. So the governance structures in those cases are different. Another point is that complexity clearly increases. As we move from government towards governance, as I've already illustrated, I think the complexity has increased, but that is not necessarily an argument to say, oh, well, this is terrible, it's too complex, there are too many actors, let's go back to a more planned and focused approach, because what you might lose in the process is some of the transparency that's come about who is doing what, who is paying for what, and so on. And so certainly from the experience of the UK, in my opinion, although some things are harder to get done now, one of the good sides of liberalisation is that we can scrutinise the different actors and what they're doing. You might always not be able to understand exactly what they're doing and what profit they're making and why, but certainly it's much easier now than it was when it was a single state-owned utility. Another point is that we have economic regulation of networks, and I think that's something we have in common with many other countries. Great at reducing prices of using those networks, so good for consumers in the short term, but what they haven't really done until very recently is foster innovation. So by just squeezing the companies to say, well, you have to spend less, do everything more efficiently, that does not encourage innovation, whereas recently there have been drivers for them to innovate, and I'll come to that in our second case study. And governance usually has multiple objectives as well, so that's an important point to bear in mind, and I guess that's a fairly obvious point. So in many of these infrastructure sectors, you're not necessarily only trying to minimize the cost to consumers, you've probably got environmental objectives, you've probably got security objectives, you may have social and industrial objectives as well. So some trade-offs and conflicts are inevitable within sectors, never mind between those sectors. But not surprisingly, we found, certainly in the UK context, there's not enough focus on this interdependencies, either at the national level or at the European level. Interestingly, at local level, you find that it comes out a bit more, mainly from the point of view of thinking about resilience, local resilience and planning, because through local authorities, I guess you've got teams which cover greater territories, so people are actually interested in looking broader than just looking at energy or water in isolation. The problem in, say, in the UK system is the local authorities lack the finance, the powers, and the people in order to really be able to have a big influence on governance. So, to quickly go through a couple of cases. So the two we've looked at are water and electricity interdependencies, particularly the role of renewable energy in the water sector. So that's where those two sectors have crossed over in the last 10 years. And the second, a slightly more recent emergence of basically smart grid demonstrations, which could link, certainly they link electricity and ICT, and at the edges, in some cases, they bring in transport through charging for electric vehicles and so on. So again, we're looking at both of these from a governance perspective, partly looking at how things have changed over time, and then trying to learn lessons about what some of the issues might have been in order to deal with these cross-sectoral issues. I'll just put this up briefly. It just gives you a snapshot of the framework we've used. It's from some other authors, Raven and Verbong from the Netherlands, who look at the provision of services in particular sectors, and they were, before us, some of the only people we could find that look at cross-sector governance like this. And basically they found 4 mechanisms through their look at some historical case studies in the Netherlands. One is that sectors sometimes compete to provide the same service. Secondly, sometimes they have symbiosis, in other words, they depend on each other. Third, they might partially integrate in the way that they provide a service to consumers. And finally, they might learn from each other. So lessons from one sector may be taken up by another. So that's something we looked for when we were going through our cases. In both cases, we saw a dynamic effect. So the nature of the interdependence changed over time. So for water and electricity first, we first had symbiosis. So you need water for the electricity sector, for example, for cooling at power stations, but you also need electricity for the water sector to pump water down pipelines, basically. So before privatization, that's before around the 1980s, we saw that as the main link. During the privatization period, so during the 1980s, 1990s, that became stronger, partly due to regulations on water quality, which meant the water companies had to use more energy in order to clean up the water and the wastewater in particular to meet more stringent environmental standards. Some spillovers because both sectors got economic regulators and they would meet and use broadly similar formulae to regulate the charges of their network businesses and to make those more efficient. We saw some temporary integration via mergers and takeovers. So some moved towards multi-utilities through the 1990s, partly because the water regulator wasn't regulating very effectively. And you can say that, frankly, in hindsight. They weren't really squeezing the efficiency out of the water companies. Hence, those water companies looked very attractive to energy companies, and so they got taken over. As soon as the water company regulator woke up and started regulating more effectively, those mergers fell apart and those companies pulled out. So hence, the temporary nature of them. They had a common environmental regulator, but interestingly, although that brought in water, air pollution, and radioactive waste altogether, it stayed rather siloed internally. So just having a common institution didn't really, at least to the extent we can find out, lead to a lot of cross-sectoral thinking. Some limited competition as well via renewable electricity generation by water companies, them starting to dabble in becoming generators of power themselves. So what are some of the reflections on this particular case? Well, first, I think strong national and international environmental agendas affected both sectors. So EU environmental regulations, both for water and electricity, had a very big impact on the way they operated through, certainly from the 1980s onwards, getting stronger through the 1990s. The shift to the integrated environmental regulator might have helped get these interdependencies better thought about, but actually internally we found that there were silos and separation between the people responsible for the two sectors. What we did find was an interesting issue of competing priorities between the two sectors. So on one hand, the water regulations were driving towards greater water quality, which meant that using more energy in order to clean up water, because the water quality was frankly very poor, we're having a lot of sea pollution and so on and so forth. But on the other hand, that increased energy demand, it potentially increased emissions, and at the same time, the energy sector regulator and government policy was saying to the energy sector, you must reduce your emissions as well. So those infrastructure providers for water were caught between those two drivers. Now, one of their responses was to say, well, let's build renewable energy, so that can square the circle. Unfortunately, the water regulator, after a little while, said, I don't think that's core business. So you can build renewable energy, but you certainly can't recover the costs of the investment from your captive consumer base. You've got to do that on commercial terms. So it was a rather short-lived dabble into renewable energy by those water companies. They did some, but certainly that was one of the issues. So you can see they were really caught between imperatives of one sector and another. So that we had some integration and some integrated thinking, but as I said, through this renewable energy generation and cross-sector mergers, but they tended to be temporary, and we'll see how that develops in future. So that's briefly case study one. The second one, Again, for electricity, ICT, and private vehicles, the private vehicle bit has really just come in very, very recently with some trials. The uptake of electric vehicles in the UK, as in many countries, has been relatively slow. It is picking up, but it's from a very, very low base. So really a lot of our story is about electricity and ICT sectors. And of course, ICT is a whole group of sectors, and it's rather different to most other infrastructures. But of course, there have been symbiotic relationships. The ICT sector in various ways for telecommunications, et cetera, needs electricity in order to work. Similarly, the electricity sector has made use of increasingly sophisticated information control, communication technologies to, for example, control the national grid and to send signals to power stations and so on. When I first did my work experience in our national electricity utility, the controller used to sit there with a bank of about 50 telephones next to their seat, and if they wanted a power station to switch on or to increase their output, they'd pick up the phone and call the manager and tell them what to do. I doubt they have those phones there anymore. I'm sure everything's been automated. But just as an example of how ICT have changed that particular industry. So we're seeing some integration more latterly. Certainly the distribution companies and the supply companies using what might be loosely termed big data, although I think because of the lack of smart metering at the domestic level, the potential for them using data as part of their commercial strategies is only just beginning to be unlocked, and who knows where that might lead in future. So we're really just seeing some potential integration there. Of course, smart grids, when we get to that, because of that requiring greater levels of information communication technologies, particularly at the local level, both to integrate things like electric vehicles, to control those networks, potentially to link into household appliances and to appliances in businesses, then clearly that's a level of sophistication well above and beyond what we have now. So much greater levels of integration will be needed. And the governance of that is still at a very early stage in the UK, we found. So again, some reflections on that case. So first is that I think it's important to know that smart grids in the UK is not really a cross-sectoral initiative. It's really being pursued in the electricity sector by trying to give incentives to distribution companies to do some demonstrations of smarter networks. So in a way, that's their center of gravity, and then it's pulling in information communication technology companies as is needed in order to support that process. So that's actually brought in some of the larger ICT players like General Electric, but it certainly, as far as we can see, hasn't brought in lots of the smaller players because they find it very hard to get in and develop relationships and contracts with the distribution companies, which is an interesting finding. That's something we need to dig into a bit more. The second observation, which is at least rather obvious if you think about it for more than a minute or two, is that the differences between those sectors are vast compared to our other case. So you've got difference in regulation. You know, we don't have an equivalent really of Ofgem, which is our electricity and gas regulator. We have a communications regulator, but it operates in very different ways. Life cycles of assets and products, electricity, traditional, safe, risk averse for all good reasons. ICT industry moving extremely rapidly, lots of change, levels of competition, innovation, relationships with consumers on all sorts of levels. Those sectors are extremely different from each other, and I think that might explain some of the tensions we might see. And the relationships, therefore, tend to be ad hoc. You know, when there needs to be a project, then they will come together, but there's certainly, we couldn't find a sense of strategic integration, and maybe there doesn't need to be in that case. That's something that we need to think a bit further about. One thing that they have in common is consumer trust is important, and that's come out in some other work we've done in the UK Energy Research Centre. Clearly for electricity, because of the controversies about energy bills in the UK, the big utilities are not trusted at all by consumers. ICT, we've had all of the discussions about privacy, whether you're giving Google all of your lifestyle data all the time, whether it matters. So there are issues of trust for both sectors, which certainly come together when you think about smart grids. So I'll end that one with a couple of quotes just to capture what we've said, one of which requires translation. So the first from the distribution company my researcher talked to, just basically reinforcing that point that GE and companies like GE, it's a shorthand for big ICT firms, have really dominated the smart grid demonstrations in the UK. And the second one does require a bit of translation. Basically what this person is saying, this is a verbatim transcript of a workshop done by my research centre on smart grids. You know, what do people think about smart grids? What they're basically saying is that, well, I'm a bit worried about these companies actually getting control of my appliances in my house. They're going to actually know what I'm up to, what's going to happen to my information. And you find that in a lot of research around smart meters and smart grids, you get these, some people saying, actually, I don't mind that. That's quite nice. And, they can control things as long as my washing's dry when I want it. But others really getting worried about the privacy issues attached to that. So a couple of slides, and this is me kind of speculating kind of what it might all mean and trying a few ideas out. So one sort of area which we've started to debate a little bit in some of the conversations I've had with people in government and elsewhere is, well, we've got all this plethora of economic regulators for different sectors. So these are the different symbols for regulators in the UK. No doubt in other countries you have a different landscape, but I'm sure in many cases there are separate regulators for separate sectors. Rail, Ofgem for electricity and gas, water, etc. And as you'll see, there's a water commission for Scotland and so on. So some people say, well, why don't we just collapse them all into one and have an infrastructure regulator? Wouldn't they deal with these governance interdependencies better? Well, possibly. But then you have to make sure internally, whatever this thing turns into, it, of course, has the internal mechanisms and organisational capacity in order to be able to join the dots between what will inevitably become sectoral silos inside. So just because something's under one roof called an integrated regulator doesn't necessarily mean you solve the problem. I think the other point is that this is a very nationally focused idea. And of course, as I've said, in many cases, your governance is distributed amongst different levels of governance. So you've got the local dimension, which in many countries is very important. The UK is getting more important in some sectors. You've got the European dimension. And I don't think this would take the politics out of the picture either. It may actually make them worse or not better. But certainly from where we are now, with a sort of siloed approach and some talking between the regulators, we can probably go further to maybe have some more top-down structures, but basically to inform more bottom-up governance arrangements where interdependencies arise. And to me, that's one of the big challenges, this interplay between a top-down view of the world from a national level and the bottom-up view of the world where you actually will see some of these interdependencies coming out in reality. So I'm just going to end with the British version of the fracking slide, which again, we've got great enthusiasm from our political leader, but so far, as you'll see by these rather inventive banners that the protest groups have used over the last 12 months in the UK, people in some of the areas which are mooted for shale gas development are far from happy. So far in the UK, we certainly haven't done very much there. So I don't imagine the changes at the macro level are going to completely negate that, but clearly that is a challenge when it comes to dealing with that particular interdependency. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Jim, thank you very much. Jim unfortunately has to leave us before the panel session at the end of the day, so he's agreed to take a few questions now, if anybody has any. Good lunch.
So, is there any element...
Just wait for the microphone for a moment, Bruce.
Oh.
We've got a recording of what you say.
So, I get the sense that this integrated infrastructure regulator or governance system would just, not passively, but sort of watch the infrastructure evolve. Is there any arm of governance that would seek to bring about some transformative change within that governance structure? In other words, in changing to piped water supply and sewerage in the Netherlands at the turn of the last century, it took 80 to 90 years for that to happen. Do we have 80 to 90 years to wait for the things that we want to have changed now change? So is, in your sort of panoply of governance, is there some arm that's thinking about stimulating deliberate transformative change?
I guess there's two answers to that question. I mean, the second part, no, we haven't got 80 or 90 years, certainly if we're worried about sustainability and issues like climate change, they're far more pressing. And I think within sectors, there's still a sense that we can do rapid changes in the infrastructure. So, for example, the introduction of water metering in my region of England, or smart metering, or the renewal of gas mains has been done on what looks like a rather planned basis. Certainly the water ones, the smart metering is yet to come. In terms of who might do it, I mean, there is a department of our finance ministry called Infrastructure UK, which is the nearest thing you get to it, which monitors big projects, and that's where some of the thinking, the nearest place in government you get to thinking going on about what more can government do to have strategic oversight of these interdependencies, seeing where there might be economic benefit from co-planning infrastructure and that kind of thing. I think the challenge it's got, of course, is that department within a department can only do so much, and it still has to work through the economic regulators, the environmental regulators, and local actors in order to make things happen, not least, and not to mention the infrastructure providers as well. So the question is, I don't think that's probably enough, but the question is how far down the road of more coordination and more powers might you need in order to get where you need to be?
Perhaps I could add something. Part of the research program that I run, International Centre for Infrastructure Futures, one of the things we are looking at academically rather than in a government department is what are the possible regulatory structures we could go to, what would the transition arrangements look like, because what we need probably rather than a super regulator is some federated set of structures, and indeed I'll use the word again that I used earlier, a place where regulators can be convened to come and talk positively about collaborative activity without forcing them to, because the default option is they just go back down in their silos. So what we're looking at is there a place where a convening body could be put in place that would facilitate discourse about more joined up behaviour, and that's a research program we're engaged in, which of course gives us the academic freedom to posit all sorts of wacky ideas without it necessarily confronting government policy, which otherwise it would have to. So we're not neglecting it. It's actually a research proposal which is funded, which is of course what it should be about. So, more questions. Sir, sorry, not sir. I do beg your pardon. I just saw a hand. And I didn't see it. I do apologise.
It's Katie, so it's not sir. Just a question, as well as looking at interdependence across sectors, and I'm sorry for the vested interest here, are you looking at interdependence across scale? So you've mentioned a lot of bottom-up governance and bottom-up action, and we've obviously talked about local municipal action. Are you looking, or is that just a step too far for the work you're going to be looking at?
I think to some extent that bit is work in progress. I mean, Raleigh, who works with me on this programme, is a geographer by trade. So, of course, she will always talk about space because geographers like to talk about space and scale. So were she to give this talk, she'd probably give that a bit more prominence. So we're looking at it a bit. But certainly in my day job at UK, that's something we're really interested in, particularly from the energy sector perspective, because, as I mentioned in passing, and obviously you know from your work, there is potential changes happening in the scale of governance for energy, lots of promise about it shifting potentially away from the centralised model, at least to some extent. So I think there's a limit to what we can look at in our particular work through ITRC, but happy to talk further.
Yes, one of the underlying things that you need to have, I think, is also awareness between the different stakeholders, if you like, of information, data, and points of view. Have you any thoughts about how this knowledge management might be brought about to make it easier for, I mean, there's still, of course, going to be resistance, but at least if there are methods and tools for sharing information and data and so on, it might be helpful. Do you have any thoughts about how that might be done?
I mean, yes. I mean, I think our second case probably illustrates that point best, in the sense that, you know, there are these smart grid trials that have been done and money has been spent. But I think it's a very good case in point where there is a need for actually extra action to capture the learning because they're demonstration projects. And one risk at the moment, which the regulator has already spotted because they've started convening meetings about it, is that all of these nice demonstrations generate a lot of data. but actually is not held in one place. There's certainly no sort of cross-demonstration evaluation, which then will feed into the next round of either learning by the companies concerned or indeed by government when it decides what to do next. So I think that's a very good example of where more action is needed. There is something called the Smart Grid Forum, which is the nearest thing you get, and that's mainly government and the electricity players with a few ICT players. But that's one of the areas where I think more involvement from ICT, but actually greater resources and ownership of the problem, so actually somebody has the responsibility to do the learning, the data sharing, and all the other things that you might think of. So it's there informally, but I feel it hasn't quite solidified, just to give you an example.
Perhaps I could ask a question. I was really pleased to see that you used the historic timelines for how, at least in our country, the infrastructure had been developed. But there were two columns that I found you didn't mention. One was taxation. In Victorian times, taxation was in single figures, all forms of taxation, which is sort of unbelievable for almost every country in the room. And secondly, land was owned by relatively few people, and there weren't any planning laws. So you had money in the hands of landowners and no regulation on what they did with the land. And that liberated them to do pretty risky and grand-scale things. We're now in a position where none of those conditions apply, at least in our country. And I just wondered to what extent that evolution had you taken into account as a opportunity or a risk for what we might be able to do in the future.
Yeah. I mean, frankly, we haven't given it a lot of thought directly in our research, but actually it's a very good point. And I suppose, you know, one thing that's said as to why the US has developed shale gas and we haven't is, of course, land ownership and that very thing you were just talking about of people owning the land and getting the benefits. Now we're going through whole sets of discussions, certainly in the UK, and I don't know if it's mirrored in other countries, of saying, well, if new infrastructures are developed, we are then having all sorts of conversations about benefits for the local community because there's this perception, you know, developers are imposing things on green space we don't want to be imposed on, even though those green spaces have changed all the time over the last 200 years, but the sense of preservation it runs into. So I think we're starting to feel our way in the UK towards a new way of capturing that, if you like, social contract. But I think it's got a long way to go, and at the moment, you know, unfortunately, when these things are talked about, they're often seen by local communities as bribes because they're led by industries, particularly the shale industry, which certainly so far has done itself no favours in terms of gaining trust. So I think we're a long way from where we were in Victorian era, and I doubt we can go back, but we do need to find other ways of dealing with that very problem you point out.
One more question? No?
Yes.
You mentioned integrating different infrastructure sectors. I was wondering what your thoughts were on wider integration. So, for instance, the integration between land use and planning and transport, for instance, and then city governance, and how that could be addressed.
Yeah, you're getting into geography territory again. I wish I had my colleague here to answer that one. I think that's just going to vary case to case and depending on, you know, which country or region you're talking about. I mean, certainly in the UK, it's very uneven. So London has particular powers which are stronger than the rest of England. Scotland has more than Wales. So your capacity to do that integrated planning depends on what jurisdiction you've got, you know, over those things. I mean, ideally, when it comes to transport, clearly you ought to be able to not only think about having some sort of ownership over what happens with roads and road repairs, what happens with tram systems, as we were hearing earlier about Vienna, but also about land use planning generally. But that often, those responsibilities sometimes aren't all in one place. So I couldn't give you any specific thoughts on that, I'm afraid. It's outside my area of expertise. But those are the immediate things I'd think of. So it becomes a governance problem where you've got more than one player in there. But even if one player has all those powers, you've then got to think about how do you balance the various interests and needs. Sorry, incomplete answer.
Jim, thank you very much indeed.
Okay, thank you.